Michelle Goldberg, who's a columnist at the New York Times, and MSNBC political analyst Jason Johnson, who's the politics editor at The Root. Jason, I'm going to start with you here at the table because, so I think of the W.E.B. Du Bois like wages of whiteness conversation, right? Where, you know, they're not, Trump doesn't have anything to offer his base. There's nothing economic on the table for them at all. As a matter of fact, he's taking from them. But he is offering them this thing that's more powerful. I think about the Democrats now. They seem to have an offer as well, which is we're going to somehow find the past when we could do policy and go back to an era when we had normal politics. Right. Is that a stronger, I mean, she said, let's do policy on immigration. Is that a stronger argument than what Trump is doing?
No, it's not a stronger policy. It's like you can't give me, I want real Coke, not Diet Coke. I want the real thing. There are people who hunger for racism. There are white people in this country who've wanted this all along. There are people, I have to say this, Joe, there are people in our industry that have wanted this, that have wanted this sort of validation from the president. And part of the failure of the Democrats is a failure of message. It's a failure of our discussion of these issues. Look, at the end of the day, this discussion, you said this brilliantly at the beginning, it's not about Donald Trump being a racist, right? I mean, like everybody today who's finally moved from racially tinged and racially sauteed to finally saying race, hey, welcome to the party, right? Die Hard Day. Welcome to the party. He finally figured it out, right? But the issue isn't just that he is racist and what he has said. It's the fact that we fail to discuss and integrate that into how we look at his policy. The Democrats don't do that. The census, it's racist. ICE raids, it's racist. All of his immigration policy, it's racist. We have to attach these words to policies. And as long as the Democrats don't do that, as long as they can pretend that we can turn back the clock to 1998, we'll continue to fail. That's the danger of this.
And, you know, Michelle, it is interesting to me that, you know, I thought it was, you know, on the one hand, people were saying, well, Trump brought the Democrats together, that, you know, got Speaker Pelosi to defend these four women. But it did strike me that at the end of her defense of them, she goes then into a plea to do immigration policy, whose immigration policy is to lock up brown people in cages and not feed them. So it's like, it's a weird turn to say that the answer then is to somehow compel him to, you know, per Jason's point, to do something other than racist immigration policy. What is the moderation between racist immigration policy and what she wants to do?
Well, I think that, you know, you see this split in the Democratic caucus because between those who want to really take on this president directly, make his unfitness, his corruption, his disloyalty to this country, make that kind of the centerpiece of Democratic politics right now and put him on trial every day in the House of Representatives. And then you have Nancy Pelosi and other people in Democratic House leadership who believe that they need to be the quote unquote adults in the room, that they need to be the face of normality in this country. And so they've been passing all of these message bills, you know, some of which are perfectly good pieces of legislation, and then they seem surprised that these bills that have no chance of ever becoming law don't kind of dominate the agenda or don't change the conversation. And I think that because Nancy Pelosi has tried so hard to tamp down the anger of the Democratic caucus and the Democratic base that should be directed at Donald Trump, instead it's been directed internally. And so you have these outbreaks of really, really counterproductive fighting and sniping within the caucus. And it's true, I think, that Donald Trump has brought them together for now, but it was this dissension and this discord that he's been exploiting in the first place by going on this racist rampage.
Right. And I mean, Jason, you had some Democratic officials circulating a poll that white working class people don't like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Well, yeah, no kidding. Right. And I'm not sure whether that means it should worry us that they realize that there are more Trumpists than we think. That in their mind, they're saying that, wait a minute, we're worried that there's a broader electorate for these racist policies, so we need to somehow appease those people in advance?
Well, it's because a lot of them still subscribe to it. I've said all along, many Democrats, not all, they don't hate Donald Trump as much as they love white supremacy because it still benefits them. So they're going to do a hit poll on their own person. But I say this about anybody who's in leadership right now, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or anybody who's running. When you're running against Donald Trump, you're running against this administration, you can make an argument about his moral failures and you can make a policy argument. Like for 2020, give me a candidate who can do both, you know, or do both. Like that's what we actually need right now. And to the degree that they want to do this circular firing squad, I personally don't care that the president is a racist, okay? I don't care that he hates brown people. We've always known that. What I care about is a party that seems to not understand how that manifests itself in an immediate danger. And I'll say this, above and beyond policy, Joy, we've had 2 members of Congress get shot in the last 10 years, a Republican and a Democrat. This kind of violence, This kind of rhetoric from this president is not just about we can clean it up with policy. These women are in danger.
Right.
And we have a party that doesn't seem to realize that.
I mean, is that the point? Do they not? I don't know what the disconnect is. Do the leadership in the Democratic Party, do they genuinely view Donald Trump as just sort of a normal, maybe a little outre Republican, and not as a danger, not just to these women? Because Jason's right. When he speaks, he calls upon a group of people who include very violent people, but also to the Constitution. Do they not see the danger of him, and they just think these women are an irritant?
I think that, no, I actually think they do see the danger, but they also see these women as an irritant. I mean, my sense is that their perception of the electorate is, was very much shaped by many, many decades of Democrats being constantly on the defensive and constantly having to run away from any association with radicalism. And so there are people like Ocasio-Cortez and other people on the left who look at the Trump election and think that a base first strategy, a strategy of being forthright about your values and saying things that didn't used to be permissible in the public discourse, can also work for progressives. And I think fundamentally, a lot of people in the Democratic leadership don't believe that. They still think that the only way back from this nightmare is to get some portion of those, I think it was 9 million people who voted for Obama and then voted for Donald Trump, rather than the people who voted for Obama and then stayed home, or the people who voted for Jill Stein, who are frankly, Trump's margin of victory in a lot of the swing states.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 7 million people didn't vote at all. Like, they're out there, too. Michelle Goldberg and Jason Johnson, thank you both.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.